Erev Tov and good evening, everyone. We are having a special Zera Shimshon learning session about Inyonei Diyoma, Inyonei Pesach. The holiday of Pesach is quickly approaching, and we are in the Zera Shimshon's section, his commentary on the Haggadah, which in the two-volume set of the Zera Shimshon's commentary on Chumash, you can find his commentary on the Haggadah right after Parshas Bo. And we're going to start with Os Aleph, section 1. This is a very long and intricate and at times very hard to understand piece. And the best I can do, the best I'll try and do tonight, God willing, is to do the first part of the section where the Zera Shimshon is going to introduce two yisodos, two fundamental ideas about matzah. This is actually called his drush on matzah, his discussion of matzah. And hopefully, even if I make some mistakes here and there or leave some things out, at least everyone will be inspired to hopefully look longer and deeper into the rest of this piece. So to begin with, we're going to take a look at a pasuk in Parshas Bo that talks about the matzah. This pasuk should sound familiar, and here is what it says. This is Perek Yud Beis pasuk Lamed Tes. Vayofu es habotzeik, and they baked the dough, asher hotziu mimitzrayim, that they took out of Egypt, ugos matzos, into cakes, into unleavened cakes, or matzah cakes. Ki lo chametz, because their dough had not leavened, had not risen. Ki gorshu mimitzrayim, because they were chased out of Egypt, v'lo yochlu lehismameya, and they were not able to delay, v'gam tzedo lo osu lahem, and they also had not made other provisions. So that is a pasuk, of course, that we're familiar with from when we're little children, about the idea of Bnei Yisrael not having enough time to let their dough rise, and therefore eating the dough in an unleavened form as matzos. So the Zera Shimshon is going to start with a quote that brings in a little piece of that pasuk as well. So let's get right in. Again, Os Aleph, number 1. Matzah zu she'anu ochli. This matzah that we eat, al shum ma. What is it due to? What is it because of? Al shum shelo hispik b'tzeikom shel avosenu lahachmitz. It is because the dough of our forefathers did not have sufficient time to rise. Ad shenigla aleihem melech malchei hamlochim hakodesh baruch hu, until Hashem appeared to them, the King of Kings HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeared to them, u'ga'olam, and redeemed them and rescued them. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, vayofu es habotzeik, they baked the dough, v'chule, etc. So that quote is the pasuk that we just read, and this little paragraph you can see appears in two places. It appears in the last parak, parak Yud, the 10th parak of Meseches Pesachim in the Mishnah there, and it also, of course, should be familiar to us from the Haggadah, when we talk about the reason for the Pesach, the matzah, and the moror. Okay, so the Zera Shimshon has 3 questions that he's going to ask. Makshim ha'olam. The world asks, v'halo, and isn't it true? Af kodem lochein nitztavu be'achilas matzah. Even before this pasuk, even before this point in the Torah, where the pasuk talks about Bnei Yisrael not having enough time to let the dough rise, even well before that, actually about 25 psukim before that, weren't Bnei Yisrael commanded to eat matzah? Shivas yomim matzos tochelu. For 7 days, you should eat matzah. So that's the first question. The Zera Shimshon doesn't describe the question, articulate the question at length, but the question should be clear to us, and that is that if the Torah first tells us that there's a mitzvah to eat matzah for 7 days, for the 7 days of the holiday, and doesn't mention anything at all about dough not having a chance to rise, and no connection to that story. It just says that there's a mitzvah to eat matzah for 7 days. And then substantially later, approximately 25 psukim later, the Torah says that Bnei Yisrael were hurrying to leave Mitzrayim, and they didn't have time to let the dough rise. And that's apparently why they ate matzah, and why we commemorate that by eating matzah. That seems a little strange. The Zera Shimshon is asking, doesn't it seem out of order? We already have the mitzvah, the commandment to eat matzah, before the story of the Jewish people not having time for their matzah to rise. So isn't that out of order? Isn't there something that doesn't fit? That's the first question. The ode, and another question, and now we're going to the top of the second column. Shenira she'ofu es habotzek ugos matzos kilo yochlu ismameya. From the pasuk, it seems like the reason they baked the dough into matzos was because they did not have time to wait. Ha'ilu hayalahem shehus. If they did have time, if they had enough time, sufficient time, hayu ofen osa chametz, then they would have baked it apparently into leavened bread. V'halo kvar nitztavu shivas yomim seor lo yimotze v'chule. But Bnei Yisrael had apparently already received the mitzvah, the commandment, the prohibition of not eating chametz, and not even having chametz in their households, in their possession during this time period. So if they had a prohibition of eating chametz and owning chametz, why were they apparently on the first morning of what ultimately became the holiday of Pesach, on that first morning, why were they baking dough and again, seemingly allowing it to rise into chametz? They weren't allowed to eat chametz. So why does the pasuk say, the only reason, I should say, why does the pasuk seemingly, apparently say, the only reason they didn't let their dough rise into chametz, into leavened bread, was because of the fact that they didn't have time? It should say they baked matzos and they didn't let the dough rise and turn into leavened bread because of the prohibition of eating chametz. That's what the pasuk should have said. The Zera Shimshon, and that's the Zera Shimshon's second question. Why does it not base the fact that they made matzah because of the prohibition, but rather base it on the fact that they did not have time to let the dough rise? V'leka l'meimar, and we shouldn't say kehahi de Rabbi Yossi Haglili, according to the view of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, one of the Tanoim brought down in the Gemara, shePesach Mitzrayim ein chimutzo noheg ela yom echad. Rabbi Yossi Haglili's view was that when the Jewish people were in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, for that very first Pesach, and the very first time in history of bringing the Korban Pesach, in other words, the time of the actual Exodus, says that the prohibition for eating chametz at that time only lasted for 1 day, for the first day of what ultimately became the 7-day holiday of Pesach. So that means starting on the first night when the Korban Pesach was being eaten, there was a prohibition of eating chametz, and along with that, a mitzvah to eat matzah. And so too, the next day, not meaning that same day, it started at night and it went into the next the daylight hours. There was also a prohibition of eating chametz and not of and a mitzvah to eat matzah. But Rabbi Yossi Haglili says that only lasted 1 day. And you might think that's the reason that Bnei Yisrael were planning to bake matzah, because Rabbi Yossi Haglili only said, that's why Bnei Yisrael, you might have thought, were planning to allow their dough to rise into chametz, because they only had a 1-day prohibition about not eating chametz, according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Zera Shimshon says, don't think that. Sheyom sheyotzu mimitzrayim hu yom rishon. the day that Bnei Yisrael left Egypt, that is the first day. V'af Rabbi Yossi Aglili kol hayom aser. And even according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says that there was only a one-day prohibition of eating chametz for the Bnei Yisrael in Egypt at the time of the Exodus, he agrees that it applied the whole day. Kidi Isa Sham B'Psachim, as the Gemara states there in Meseches Psachim. So the question, to explain this second question, what it means is, why were Bnei Yisrael apparently planning to bake bread, leavened bread, to bake chametz when they had a prohibition? And the Zera Shimshon says, don't try and answer and respond to me that they were doing it because of Rabbi Yossi Aglili's view that the whole prohibition only lasted one day. This, after all, was the morning of the first day. So on the morning of the day when it was forbidden to have this chametz, to own it and to eat it, how in the world can we say that they were planning to let the dough rise and become leavened bread? That's question number 2. The Od Kasha, and another question, this is the third question, How you yoshvinu mitzapin legeula. Bnei Yisrael, before they were actually allowed to physically leave Mitzrayim, and before they actually began their journey to freedom from Mitzrayim, they were waiting for the redemption, shetavo, that it should come any minute, right? The morning after the Makas Bechoros, the killing of the firstborn, Bnei Yisrael knew big things are happening, major events are happening. The Geula could come at any moment. And why would they have entered and forced themselves to be in such a pressured, high-pressured situation? Lolush Isa, to knead dough, be'oso zman chipazon, at that exact time of tremendous hurrying and rushing. Everyone, after all, is rushing around and packing up their things and getting ready for Moshe's declaration. It's time to leave Mitzrayim. The time of Geula, the time of redemption is at hand. Everyone was preparing for that moment. It's hard to imagine that they decided this is the best time to start making, kneading dough and making bread. And why weren't they concerned that if they did do this, it could perhaps become leavened during their journey, during their trip? And apparently they weren't allowed to eat chametz during those first 7 days, based on the pasuk, again, that came earlier than the pasuk we read, where it said, Shivas Yomim, for 7 days, the Jews should only eat matzah and should not eat chametz. Those are the 3 questions. Ibra, indeed, Shahatosus Yontif, Vikol Haramaz, 2 Meforshim, the Tosus Yontif and a sefer called Kol Haramaz, the Perek Basra de Psachim, on the last Perek of Meseches Psachim, again, the 10th Perek, Tirtzu Bozeh. They answered 2 of these questions. In actuality, they answer questions 2 and 3, which both have to do with why Bnei Yisrael was apparently planning, why Bnei Yisrael were apparently planning to let their dough rise and become chametz steak on the first morning of the holiday of the Geula. Why were they planning to do that? So the Zera Shimshon says, if you look in the Tosas Yontif and the Kol HaRamaz, you'll see answers to those 2 questions, and we'll circle back to that a little bit. The Zera Shimshon will circle back to that. Ve'afa kusha harishona, and even the first question, and let's remind ourselves what that is. The first question was, if the Torah had already said there would be a 7-day holiday when the Bnei Yisrael were obligated to eat matzah and couldn't eat chametz, then why, and there's no apparent connection to anything about hurrying and leaving and not having time to let the dough rise, how come later on, 25 sukkim later, the Torah talks about the Bnei Yisrael not having time to let the dough rise, and that's seemingly where the whole idea of matzah came from. That was the first question. Nuchal l'taretz, we are able to answer that question as well. B'ma shekosav hazevach Pesach, with what is written in the commentary named the Zevach Pesach. This is the commentary of the Abarbanel, an extremely famous Torah commentator who lived during the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. And he wrote many well-known commentaries on books of Tanakh and on the Haggadah. And he writes, Sheyesh shtei mine matzah, that there are two aspects to matzah, to the mitzvah of eating matzah. They're almost as if to say, if we translate it literally, there are two types of matzah. Achas zecher le'inoi v'shibud. One is to commemorate the suffering and the oppression, umishum hachi lechem oni, and therefore it is called lechem oni. It is called the bread of affliction or the bread of suffering. That's one type of matzah or one aspect of matzah. Ve'achas zecher legeula, and one type of matzah is to commemorate the redemption. So the Abarbanel, Zera Shimshon is bringing in the Abarbanel to give us our first yesod, our first fundamental principle, and that is that matzah has two elements or two aspects. The first aspect or the first type of matzah is a mitzvah to eat matzah to remember the suffering in Egypt when Bnei Yisrael, when the Jewish people didn't even have bread to eat and they didn't even have a whole bread to eat. They had pieces of matzah, pieces of broken, unleavened bread called lechem oni, the bread of affliction. And then a second aspect or a second type of matzah is the matzah that represents and commemorates the redemption from Mitzrayim, not the slavery and oppression, but rather the redemption from Mitzrayim and the exodus, the Yetzias Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt. The Asi Shapir Lefizeh, and everything becomes clear, or everything can now become explained through this. Pesach Mitzrayim ein chimutzo noheg ela yom echad bilvad. That when we talk about Rabbi Yossi Aglili's view, that which the Zera Shimshon mentioned before, that in Mitzrayim Bnei Yisrael only had 1 day, not 7 days, 1 day of a mitzvah to eat matzah, and a prohibition, a corresponding prohibition of consuming chametz. The hainu zecher l'shibud. This is referring to the matzah, to the aspect of matzah that commemorates the suffering and the oppression and the servitude of Bnei Yisrael. That aspect of matzah is the only aspect of matzah that Bnei Yisrael in Egypt, before they left, were given a commandment to eat matzah along with the Korban Pesach. That matzah was the lechem oni. That matzah was the bread of affliction that was commanded for them to eat as a sign of their suffering. Shahare min acher, because the other aspect or type of matzah, shehi zecher legeula, which commemorates the redemption, adayin lo zachu ba. They still did not merit to eat that, to have a commandment to eat that type of matzah. Shelo nikres geula shlema, because the redemption was not considered complete ela la'achar kriyas yamsuf, until the splitting of the Yamsuf, and when the Jews were truly finally freed from the power of Egypt, because the Egyptian army was destroyed at that point and at that time, which we know was Shvi'i Shel Pesach, not the first day of Pesach, but the 7th day of Pesach. So the Geula, the redemption wasn't considered complete until the Kriyas Yamsuf, which took place on the 7th day of Pesach. K'moshe Kosav HaTosfos Yontif, as the Tosfos Yontif, the commentary that the Zera Shimshon mentioned on Mishnayos, states in his commentary on the Mishnayos in the 10th parak of Maseches Pesach. Ume'ata, now the Zera Shimshon is going to take this principle articulated, enunciated by the Abarbanel, and he's going to explain how that helps us understand our questions. Ume'ata, and from now that we understand this principle, al korchach tzorech lomar, we are compelled to say, Shema shekosav shivas yomim, matzos tochelu, when the Torah earlier on, right earlier on in Parshas Bo, when the Torah brings the mitzvah of for 7 days you should eat matzos, hu ledoros haboim. That is a mitzvah for future generations. That was not a pasuk, a mitzvah, commandment that applied to the Jewish people at that time of the Exodus. The pasuk was stated to Bnei Yisrael then, was stated by Hashem to Moshe, and Moshe shared it with Bnei Yisrael, but it was for future generations. It wasn't for that year when they were actually leaving Egypt. She'elu heim l'siman ha'geula, because these days of eating matzah, this mitzvah of eating matzah for 7 days, that's a sign of the redemption. She'ba'a lahem b'shvi shel Pesach, which only came to them, meaning it was only completed on the 7th day of Pesach, when Kriyas Yamsuf took place. V'hamatzah shel halayla harishona, and the matzah of the first night of Pesach, which Bnei Yisrael in Mitzrayim ate in that first year when they did the Korban Pesach, the first Korban Pesach, al matzah u'merorim, and they ate, and there the Torah said, eat matzah and moror and bitter herbs with the Korban Pesach. He zecher l'shibud. That matzah commemorates the servitude and the subjugation. V'nicha shapir, and it makes good sense, this samich lekra, that right near this pasuk that talks about eating matzah and moror and bitter herbs with the Korban Pesach, again, for the Jewish people at the time of the Exodus. Samich lekra, it puts another pasuk nearby, ach bayom harishon, however, on the first day, you must destroy the leavened bread, which implies that only on that first day was there a prohibition of having leavened bread, possessing it or eating it. The ach, because the word ach, however, lashon miyut hu, it is a language that implies exclusion. Meaning, why did the Torah say ach only on the first day? Because the Zera Shimshon is explaining, because the Torah was saying only this year, the first year of celebrating the Korban Pesach, only this year is there a 1-day prohibition of eating chametz and owning chametz, and a corresponding mitzvah to eat the matzah. But for future years, there will not be a 1-day prohibition or a 1-day mitzvah. It will be a 7-day mitzvah of eating matzah and prohibiting the consumption of chametz. Let's pause here, because this concludes the Zera Shimshon's first approach to answering the 3 questions that he started with. So let's make sure we understand this before we begin a much longer section which introduces a whole new approach. So the Zera Shimshon, again, bringing the Abarbanel's commentary on the Haggadah, has taught us about 2 aspects of matzah, meaning we should never view matzah in a monolithic fashion, as if matzah is one thing and represents and symbolizes one thing, and that's the end of the story. No, he says that matzah has 2 very different aspects. One aspect of the matzah applied to Bnei Yisrael and commemorates their suffering in Egypt before the Geula. And the Jews of Egypt of that time, and the Jews who left Egypt, were commanded, when they brought the Korban Pesach, the first Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, they were commanded to eat matzah. That matzah is what we call lechem oni, the bread of affliction, and that's the matzah that corresponds to, that commemorates the Shibud Mitzrayim. Then there's a second aspect of the matzah, which you might say is almost the complete opposite, because it doesn't recall and it doesn't commemorate the suffering and the subjugation of Bnei Yisrael. It recalls and it commemorates the Geula, the redemption of Bnei Yisrael. And that aspect of matzah was not something that Bnei Yisrael in Egypt in that year of the Exodus itself were commanded to eat. That was only a command for future generations. And that's why it would last for 7 days, because the Geula started on the first day of Pesach, and the Geula was completed by Kriyas Yamsuf on the 7th day of Pesach, and that could only apply Klal Yisrael in future years, but not to the Bnei Yisrael in the first Pesach, who still had not experienced the Kriyas Yamsuf, who were still just in the process of beginning to leave Mitzrayim and initiate the journey that would ultimately take them on the seventh day to the shores of Kriyas Yamsuf. So therefore, what the Zera Shimshon intends for us to understand is that the first question, where he talked about the 7-day mitzvah to eat matzah, not mentioning the hurrying up and leaving, and then later on the hurrying up and leaving seemingly coming later on, now we can understand the mitzvah of the 7 days. That was the mitzvah for future generations, and that was something Bnei Yisrael at the time could not yet understand or relate to, because they hadn't yet experienced the completion of the redemption at the Yam Suf. And Bnei Yisrael, why is it that they were getting up and they were seemingly ready to bake their leavened bread on the first day of Pesach, when even according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili it was prohibited on that day? The answer is they were baking chametz. They were planning, I should say, to bake chametz for the future days. There was only a 1-day prohibition, and therefore they could bake chametz that morning and save it to the next day and be able to proceed, because the prohibition wouldn't apply to them for the 7 days of the holiday, as would be the case for the future generations. So now let's move on to the next approach, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're only going to be able to start and not complete. It's a very lengthy exposition. Ve'o derech drush nuchal lomar. Zera Shimshon says there is another approach which he calls in the way of drush, in the way of a extrapolation, or the way of a deep kind of interpretation. And although the Zera Shimshon himself doesn't quote the Kabbalah, the sources on the Zera Shimshon show that this is rooted in the Zohar. And he says, Sheyodua shetam iser hachometz veheter achilas matzah. It is well known in the Kabbalistic writings that the deep reason behind the prohibition to eat chametz and the permissibility, actually the commandment to eat matzah during Pesach, who remez, it is a hint, l'sibas avodah zora ve'elohim acherim, to the idol worship and to the other gods, to the concepts of idolatry and the worship of other gods. The Yisrael yotzu mirishus Elohim acherim, and chametz and matzah represents the transition that the Jewish people made from being in a domain of idolatry and other gods. That, of course, is a reference to Mitzrayim. V'nichnesu l'rishus hayochid, and they left Mitzrayim and entered a domain of a yochid, of a singleness. And that, of course, is a reference to Hashem, as the Zera Shimshon continues. Yechido shel olam HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the one unified phenomenon and unifying phenomenon in the universe, which is Hashem. So the Zera Shimshon is here telling us a second yesod, a second fundamental principle, and that is that chametz and the prohibition to eat chametz during the holiday of Pesach represents avodah zarah, represents idolatry, and that is what was the prevalent force in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. And when Bnei Yisrael when Hashem took Bnei Yisrael out of Mitzrayim, he was taking them out of a world controlled, filled with, I should say, avodah zarah, with idolatry, to a world of serving Hashem and belief in emunah in Hashem. And the Jewish people made that journey during the holiday of Pesach, chametz representing the world of avodah zarah, the world of Egypt, and matzah representing the world of Hashem, the domain of service only to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The in hachinami, and of course we concede HaKadosh Baruch Hu tziva liyisrael sheba'oso hador, that Hashem commanded Bnei Yisrael, even of that first generation that was in Egypt and that was experiencing the exodus of Egypt, lotseis mirishus Elohim acherim, to leave, to go out from the domain of other gods, of idolatry, ulehikones l'rishus HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to enter into the domain of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Not only when the Zera Shimshon says he commanded them to do that, he means he commanded them to have a prohibition of chametz and a mitzvah of eating matzah in order to reflect this movement from out of a world of idolatry into a world of service of Hashem. V'zehu hatzivoy shebeparshas hachodesh, and this is the commandment of eating matzah and the prohibition of eating chametz that we see in Parshas Bo, in Perek Yud Beis, where these mitzvahs, where the Torah talks about hachodesh hazel lachem, the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people of setting up, of establishing a Jewish calendar, and the month starting with the month of Nisan for the holidays, and then it talks about the mitzvos of several mitzvos, one of them being eating matzah, and one of them the prohibition of chametz. So this is that point is the beginning of Hashem's commandments to prohibit chametz, which represents avodah zarah, and to command the eating of matzah, which represents the domain of service of Hashem. Top of the next column. Umnam, however, Yisrael nizdarzu b'tov leiv u'v'das nechona. The Jewish people figured out that through a good heart and a correct understanding, Shahakosov Omer ushmartem es hamatzos, the pasuk said you should guard the matzos. The Omru b'Gemara, and in the Gemara Chazal learn out from that pasuk that devorim haboyim lidei chimutz, only things which can become leaven, only types of grain which can become leaven, odom yotze bohem yedei matzah. Can a person fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah? Has sha'ar minim, but other types of grains, no, you cannot make matzah out of other types of grain that can't become leaven. Mishum de lo boi behu shimur, because guarding against them becoming leaven, against them rising, would not apply. They wouldn't need that kind of shimur, that kind of guarding. So Chazal say the fact that the Torah talks about guarding the matzos, which means not letting the matzos become leaven, not letting them rise, means that we must be talking, that the Torah must be talking about types of grain, such as rice. The Chazal teach us 5 types of, not rice. They teach us 5 types of grain that we can use, such as wheat and barley and oats and spelt and rye, and you can use only those because those types of grain can rise in leaven and become leavened bread. However, other things such as rice and millet and other things that you can grind up and make a type of bread with or make types of cakes with, those cannot be used to make matzah because there is no shmira, there's no guarding them from rising to prevent them from rising because they can't rise and they can't become leaven. V'choshvu b'libam, and Bnei Yisrael at that time, meaning the generation in Egypt, thought in their hearts, im onu mamtinim lalush isasenu achar yitziasenu mimitzrayim. If we wait to knead our dough until after we leave Egypt, ein zu matzah ketikuna. This would not make matzah in its best and ideal way. So if Bnei Yisrael, understanding on a deep level this idea that that they were leaving Egypt, Mitzrayim, a world full of avodah zarah, and they were brought out to a world full of serving only Hashem, and that was going to be their journey, their transition. They thought, oh, so we should possibly wait to do our matzah, make our matzah until we're completely out of Mitzrayim and freed from Mitzrayim, freed from Egyptian control and servitude. But then they said, but if we wait, then that will not be the best way to make matzah. Because once we leave Mitzrayim completely, we'll be fully in the domain of Hashem. Yechido shel olam, the unity, the one unity in the world. Ve'ein od shom shlitas hasaor ve'hachametz. And then there will no longer be any power left to that is represented by the leaven and the chametz, which represents the power of avodah zarah. Elachova aleinu, but rather it is an obligation on us, be'od she'anu b'mitzrayim, while we are still in Egypt. Makom hasaor, the place of leaven, meaning the place of idolatry. Lalush isa, to knead dough, ulashamra, and to guard it, shelo tachmitz, that it shouldn't become chametz. Ve'achar kach lechol osa tachas rishos hakodesh baruch hu. And after we've made this matzah in the best possible way, which means in Mitzrayim itself, so we've made it in a situation and in circumstances which show here we are in the world of avodah zarah, and we are not eating chametz. We're rejecting the avodah zarah, and we're baking matzah. That's the best way to make matzah. Bnei Yisrael figured out. Then they could take it with them and eat it once they were fully redeemed from Egypt and were out of Mitzrayim completely, under the wings of the Shekhinah, into the domain of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we're going to stop here. I hope, as I said in the beginning, that this little taste and these two fundamental principles that the Zera Shimshon developed for us will inspire and encourage everyone to try and tackle the rest of the piece, which is complicated and lengthy. However, even with where we've covered, we have seen two important principles, very different approaches that the Zera Shimshon explained to us about the understanding of chametz and matzah in the Zera Shimshon's words. Yasher koach for everyone joining us tonight in this special session, and a little bit of preparation for Chag HaPesach, and